In this one, we're going to look at the origins of apartheid, starting with 1910 when they get their Dominion status and their first step towards independence from Great Britain, all the way up until 1948 when they officially embrace apartheid and go full for segregation. So we'll kind of look at the path towards that complete segregation in 1948. And it's a windy path through several different governments, as you can see in this chart, as we see different governments rise and fall over time, until eventually, in blue, we see the National Party take over and will really dominate throughout the time of apartheid. And so let's break down this philosophy of racism, how they came to this belief. So nobody's born racist. This is something that was taught over time. And so one of the basic ideas of apartheid is based on the assumption that various ethnic groups are different from each other, and that an entire ethnic group will have the same common physical characteristics, but also have certain mental characteristics and certain ways that they act. They're all the same somehow. Therefore, if we have that basic assumption, they're all the same in a given group, there must be a hierarchy of races, because some groups will have traits that make them better than others. The cultural achievements of the white race proved its superiority, followed by coloreds and Indians, and then with blacks at the bottom of this hierarchy, according to the South African Afrikaners. And therefore, they saw this as just something within nature. It's something natural, and they wanted their government to include this. So they wanted racial inequalities to be reflected in government policy, and that government should work to promote the interests of the higher races while keeping all these races separate. And so here's a little piece of propaganda from South Africa pushing forward this idea of the development of races and the culture of races. And so we've got Blancaras, where they've got this massive city, Gelaras, where it's kind of a medium city, Zwarteras, which is kind of a smaller village. And so they're seeing development in these groups, and therefore they're different, and we need to treat them differently. Moving on with this idea, it also has its roots in the philosophy of social Darwinism. Very popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and this led to some horrible things, including eugenics, where we're literally trying to breed the perfect human race by selecting desirable qualities, and also trying to eliminate or just execute or sterilize anybody that we see with qualities we don't like. And this leads to, in many ways, starts in America, it goes into Germany, it leads to mass sterilizations in America, it leads to mass executions in Germany and Nazism. So it can lead down a dark path if you try to perfect the human race. What they're doing here is they're applying Darwin's theory of natural selection to humans. And so they're looking at some scientific theories and trying to match them up with these race theories. And it leads to horrible, horrible things. This goes down to the idea from Herbert Spencer. Darwin never said this, the idea of survival of the fittest. This is social Darwinism. It's a part of human nature. And the superior races should dominate the inferior races, so that there are natural master races and natural slave races over time. And so here's a bit of more propaganda stating that just the shape of a face can show intelligence. Just more false science. And at the time, this was science. And this would have been in a biology textbook. There are also religious aspects to it, especially Calvinism. Apartheid supporters used Calvinist scripture and reasoning to justify their actions. And who is Calvin? John Calvin's a Swiss religious reformer, and we see the split between the Protestants and Catholics. He is one of the guys that's splitting, and so he's looking for changes in the church. And he argued that society is divided between those that are chosen by God, those that are saved for salvation, and those that have been condemned to eternal damnation. So there's this automatic split. And it's even before you're born, God's already chosen. This one's going to heaven, this one's going to hell. And so you have to live a perfect life. And if you at one point screw up and go to hell, then it was just always meant to be. And so the idea of predestination has a lot of pressure. It's a very extreme and very harsh view. And so he calls for a very stern and moralizing approach to society. He also wants a strong mix of religion and government. he heavily influences the Pilgrims and Puritans of New England in the 1600s. And so that extreme view of Christianity for the Puritans, that's coming from Calvin and his influence. And it moves on into South Africa too. And some of the ideas that they use, the idea that God created different races and wants them to remain separate, and therefore it's the destiny of the chosen people, or the Afrikaners, to rule and ensure that his divine will is enforced. And so it's a very elitist view where it's got to be there are chosen people and there are people that are not chosen. And if you're not chosen, you're out of luck. And so here's a little bad luck Brian to kind of emphasize that point. More on this philosophy. And so putting this all together, over time, the Afrikaners start to see themselves as special. And in history terms, we use the idea of exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is used quite a lot, the idea that America developed a certain way, hoorah America. But the Afrikaners see themselves in a similar fashion, hoorah Afrikaner. The idea that the Afrikaner experience is unique compared to other nations, that they are special and stand out amongst everybody else. And that they can trace their roots back all the way to the Trek Boers, living on the colonial frontier, cut off from Europe, so they're no longer European, they're something different, special. Their religious outlook resulted in an Old Testament worldview, seeing themselves as the Israelites escaping the oppression of the British. The British get rid of slavery in 1833, and this leads some of the Boers to take on the Great Trek to the Promised Land and to escape this British influence to stop them from keeping slaves. Any lands where they settle just so happen to be pretty cleared out, and this is because of the Mafekane, reinforcing their belief in divine deliverance. They show up in these lands, it's nice and cleared out. Well, that's because the tribes were just fighting each other because you guys were moving in. Victory over the Zulu at the Battle of Blood River in 1938 further reinforces this belief that they are the chosen people. And right after that victory, they make a covenant with God saying, hey, if we bring civilization, we save South Africa, you're going to make sure that we gain your favor at all times. We do get clashes with the Xhosakisms, leading to a feeling of animosity between the Boers and the black people of the region. And so there's more fights because there is competition for the land there. And we also throw in a little bit of religious verse here, and that Africans become equated with the biblical son of Ham, condemned by God to be the laborers. And so they're using scripture to also push this idea that these people are different and we're special. Even the Boy Scouts started to be influenced by this philosophy in South Africa, where the Boy Scouts split off to form their own group, the Voortrekkers. It's an African youth organization founded in the 30s, and the 30s is when this idea really gets strong. And it takes the idea of the Boy Scouts, but then it has some of this wacky stuff in there too. And eventually it does kind of shrink away. Segregation in early practice, so it was a slow process coming to this, but by 1948 it got a lot faster. Some historians trace the segregation all the way back to the British rule in the Cape Colony, that first major colony, but the British take over in the 1800s. This runs against the view that the British were paternalistic, they were trying to take care of and always help out the Africans. But not necessarily. History just doesn't show that. Following the British takeover in 1815, British towns were established on the frontier of Cape Town, further and further east, and so they established East London and Grahamstown. And as they start to get contact with some of the local tribes, this led to increased British racism. As they started to get in fights, they started to hate those that they were fighting. In the 1853 Constitution, they started to distinguish between those that are civilized, white, and those that are uncivilized, black. And those that were uncivilized or black were required to carry these passes, these passbooks that become a central part of South African life, to regulate their movements and also to prevent them from leaving their jobs. So if you want to keep your black workers in the mine or on the farm, we're going to pass laws to make sure that happens. We also start to see segregation, residential segregation as far as where they can and cannot live. And so they may be allowed to work in the white neighborhood, but when the sun goes down, they go home. And we see similar things in America, the idea of sundown towns. And so there's a curfew on blacks to prevent them from entering white areas at night so that they don't live there. But they can be the maids, they can be the farmers, that's fine. This is created out of fear of overcrowding and lower standards of living in urban areas with an influx of immigration. So they want to keep this a lowly populated, just a white area. But if we start to mix things in, it would ruin the neighborhood. One case that really pushes forward and solidifies this idea is in 1901, the outbreak of plague shows up in Cape Town, and this results in the creation of the first black township. And so they blame the plague on black people, and so they create the town of Ndabani, which is this specifically black town on the edge of the city, and this will segregate them over there. They can still come in the city to work, but when they go home on the edge. They didn't actually bring the plague. It was actually the British that brought the plague. It was troops coming in from South America and India that brought the plague. But don't bring logic into racism. More segregation, hooray. Racial discrimination was also practiced in the Boers. It's not just a British thing. In the republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State, the republics were recognized by the British on the condition that they got rid of slavery. And they said, sure, we get rid of slavery, but they still had slavery. And the constitutions were fine with it and definitely pushed the idea of the supremacy of the white race over black. But once they find gold in those Dutch republics, then the British start to move in like crazy. They expand the city of Johannesburg, and we start to see a major concentration of wealth where a couple of very, very rich British guys own these mines, and they're known as the Rand Lords. I don't know why. We start to see fights between the British, the Uitlanders, or kind of outsiders that are English, and the Rand Lords, and the Afrikaners. So the two white groups start to fight the British and the Afrikaners on whether or not to extend the vote to all whites, or just the Boers should be allowed to vote in the Boer republics. But you have all these British people moving in. So this does lead to the South African War. And here's a little cartoon of the British fighting the Boers. Ha ha ha. In the end, they have their nasty, nasty war, but by the end of this, they put their differences aside and say, hey, we're white, and let's stay in power. And so both sides agree to maintain white domination when it comes to politics. Only white people get to vote, but also in the economy. And the best jobs should go to the white people, and the worst jobs are going to go to the black people. And so in the case of the Afrikaner farmers, they need cheap labor that is not allowed to leave the farm. So this system's going to help them. As far as the rich British Rand Lords, they need cheap labor that's not going to leave the mine. The system works for them. And then for the Uitlanders, the kind of poor English guys, they want labor protection so that they can keep the best jobs, and so that they're not going to have black people coming in and taking their better jobs. And so the system, let's take a look at the government piece by piece and some of these creepy looking white dudes. The South African Party is in power from 1911 to 1924. And they start to slowly bring in this system of segregation so that it benefits them for the reasons I just mentioned as far as keeping a labor force and keeping in power. And so first we have Louis Botha up top with the creepy eyes, and John Smuts, the general, down there. The goal is creating the system of segregation, and they go through a series of different laws, and some of these laws are more important, and we're going to go into these laws in more detail later. The 1910 Act of Union was, basically this was restricting voting rights so that it's just for the whites, and this early one, they did allow some voting rights to a small amount of colored and black voters in urban areas. But largely, it's 99% white. It's just 1% they allow to vote early on. That'll be taken away soon. 1911, the Mine and Works Act reserved all skilled labor for whites, and this left only low-wage, unskilled labor for blacks. So the best jobs go to whites, the worst jobs go to blacks. Big one to know, 1913, the Native Lands Act. This brings segregation in on a massive scale across the country, and it's just expanded over time and solidified over time. This prohibited blacks from owning or renting land outside of areas known as native reserves, which made up 7.5% of the country. So it's similar to the Native American reservations in that they take the worst parts of land where you can't actually grow anything and nobody wants to live there, and they say that's yours now, you're allowed to only live there. The native reserves soon became overcrowded because they take 2/3 of the population and they shove them, and so we've got 66% of the population shoved into 7.5% of the land. And so they give them the worst land, so these lands just fall apart and get really overcrowded and nasty. Africans were only allowed to live outside of these reserves if they had a specific job, if they were specifically employed by whites, so they had to figure out to work the system, otherwise they're stuck on these pretty nasty reservations. 1923, the Natives Urban Areas Act declared that cities were for the white population, and blacks had to carry a pass or be deported to the reserves. So you had to have your pass just walking around the city, otherwise you are deported off to the reserves. 1924 Industrial Consolation Act allowed whites but not blacks to join unions, and so if a bunch of black workers wanted to demand better pay or things like, hey, how about some health care? They're not allowed to join unions, and that's for white people. And so we get a lot of restrictions starting off early on. But wait, it gets worse. The National Party takes it a step further, and they're going to take it and run with it. The National Party is a coalition led by JBM Herzog, who takes power in 1924. There he is with the mustache. He has a more extreme version of segregation, so they pass in a few more laws. The 1925 Wage Act encouraged businesses to hire white workers and give them preference. 1926 Mines and Works Amendment further entrenched the segregation in mining and made sure that the best jobs go to whites. Then the Great Depression comes along and changes things a bit. The Great Depression leads to a new United Party government taking over in 1934 because with the economy crashing, people get nervous and then want to switch up their governments. Anytime the economy crashes, we switch parties in America. It's very common. And so we see this new party where we merge Smuts. Smuts up here. He is the general down there with a little goatee. And Herzog's NP up here with a mustache. And so the facial hair party. And we get this united party together. And they're united because of they're worried about this guy. A more radical extreme party, the Purified National Party, the Gesuurde National Party, the GNP. They're going to pretty extreme measures of segregation. So in order to keep people from voting and keep people away from that guy, they're also going to pass a bunch of laws on kind of medium segregation to keep the white population at least satisfied. And so some of these laws include the 1936 Reservation of Natives Act, removed Africans but not coloreds from the electoral roll in the Cape. So again, it's further restrictions on voting. Creates an advisory Natives Representative Council made up of traditional African leaders which lacked any real power. So what that one does is each of these little reservations gets to have a traditional leader, but really it's just a puppet leader. They don't have any power. And so it's basically saying, hey, here you go. You have a voice in your government, but that voice doesn't really do anything, so it's very fake. 1937, the Natives Laws Amendment Act allowed for stricter enforcement of past laws. In the 30s, we get some more extreme groups like the Afrikaner Brotherhood. It's a very extreme wing of populist Afrikaner nationalism. They organize celebrations of the Great Trek that I mentioned earlier and the Battle of Blood River, and they set up these pretty massive monuments. This increases Afrikaner nationalism in the late 1930s, so they weren't necessarily following this path where it was getting closer and closer to segregation, but this group really convinces people, and it increases this Afrikaner nationalism, it increases white animosity and this desire for segregation. And it kind of creates this nice little storyline and ties it all up nice in a bow. So, yeah. The GNP and the Afrikaner Brotherhood, they were supported by poor Afrikaners, so poor whites, that they're feeling pretty low, they want to feel better than somebody else, and this allows them to have that white pride, which leads to some horrible things. And they were alienated by the United Party, which failed to increase and make their lives better for all whites. And so rich whites were doing fine, middle-class whites were doing fine, poor whites weren't. And so this idea of racial superiority really appeals to them. It gives them something. We saw the same thing in American slavery. And so they want more segregation. They want more rights specifically for white people. And so they create this massive monument, and it's now a World Heritage Site. It's protected by the UN. The Voortrekker Monument, constructed in 1937, 1949. It's pretty amazing how it's made. It's actually surrounded by these, it's a stone wall of these little wagons. And it's designed perfectly so that on the anniversary of the Battle of Blood River, a single light shines down on an empty grave That says, "We for thee, South Africa," representing anybody that died for the creation of South Africa. So it's a pretty impressive memorial, even if it's got issues. World War II comes along and shakes things up even more. South Africa joins the Allies in World War II. Herzog resigns from the government in protest. He doesn't want to be part of the war, and he joins Milan to reunite the National Party. And so the two kind of Afrikaner wings are now back together because they don't want to be part of this war because, well, their ideas line up with the Nazis really well. They like a lot of the Nazi ideas. And so a lot of the Afrikaners supported the Nazis, and so they protest the government by basically switching parties to become the National Party. To build the weapons of war, they have all these factories in the major cities. And this leads to more black people moving to the cities, as they want to build tanks and planes and all that. And so we start to, because they're not actually allowed to live in the cities, it is illegal. Many of them are breaking the laws by doing that. Squatter camps grow on the outskirts of the major cities as the black labor force grows in confidence and militancy. Trade unions were formed in defiance of the law, even though they're not allowed to form unions. And so in one case, African Mine Workers Union leads a 1946 strike with 100,000 miners, and it gets pretty nasty. The police get in and kill 9 of the strikers. Following the strike, the government has to figure out, okay, what do we do? We've got a lot of black people moving into the cities, it's getting crowded, and they're breaking the laws. What do we do? And so the government of Smuts, he sets up the Fagan Commission to investigate what to do, and they decide, well, let's just let them live in the cities, and let's relax the past laws, and maybe in a few years, we can just get along. We can be together. We can be integrated. And the National Party says, no, and they come up with their own Soye Commission that concludes that the survival of the white race in South Africa requires the reversal of black urbanization. We've got to kick them out, put them back on the reservation, and we need to completely separate the races. We need to be afraid. And so they have election based on these two ideas, integration or segregation. This is the big election of 48. The National Party's vision is very clear. Segregation, kick them out, and be afraid. If we don't kick them out, we're going to die. The white people are going to be kicked out, so we need to segregate. Whereas the UP's, the United Party's platform is very complicated, saying, hey, maybe one day we can work towards integration. We're not sure how we're going to get there. It's going to be complicated, but we'll be better if we can unite. And so this vision of fear, it's going to win. And it appeals to Afrikaner voters driven by that fear. And they play up on that. And so they play up with party slogans of Swart Gevaar, the black peril, and Rooi Gevaar, the red peril. This also raises the issues of the white cities being surrounded by black communities, but also this fear of communism, red peril, and that there was some communist leadership within these anti-apartheid groups. And they accused Smuts of being pro-communist because he worked with Stalin during World War II. In the end, the National Party, Milan's National Party, wins the election of 48. Yes and no. The United Party wins the popular vote by a lot, by about 100,000. However, more districts went to the National Party. And so it's the idea that the big cities, they voted for integration in the United Party. But the poor whites in the countryside, they voted out of fear, and they went with the Nationalist Party. And so in the end, even though the Nationalist Party only got 37% of the vote, they get 45% of the seats in Parliament. The United Party got 49% of the vote. They only got 42% of the seats in Parliament. So it's a matter of redistricting. It's similar to our messy electoral college and districting issues. Same thing happened in South Africa in 48. And so in the end, that's where we'll leave off, with the Nationalist Party ready to really ramp up segregation.